Same thing every morning. Black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, alone at the corner table. For 30 years, no one had given him a second glance, until that morning when Miller's cup fell and he noticed the tattoo on the man's arm. That's when he realized he wasn't looking at just another retiree, but a living legend. Welcome to the Real Life Stories. Before we begin this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The cafeteria at Fort Braxton Military Base awakened every morning with the same ritual. At 6:30 a.m., the lights would come on. At 6:45 a.m., the first coffee machine would start working. And at 7 a.m., the doors would open. In the cold morning air of North Carolina, the scent of hot coffee and freshly cooked eggs would dance in the air. The cafeteria was large, sterile, and efficiently organized. Long white tables arranged in rows, each with seating capacity for 6 people. Fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling illuminated every corner, while military photographs and flags on the walls gave the place an official atmosphere. But this morning, like every morning, the most unremarkable person was sitting at the same corner table. Frank Thompson, 75 years old, was a gray-haired man with a slight limp. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., he would enter through the cafeteria doors. Always the same clothes, worn blue jeans, a white button-up shirt, and the brown leather jacket that never left him. He was never in a hurry, never showed anxiety, just slow, measured steps toward his corner table. That table was in the farthest corner of the cafeteria, next to the window, but not to watch outside. Frank never watched outside. His eyes were always inside the cafeteria, but positioned so he wouldn't make eye contact with anyone, as if he could see everyone, but didn't want to be seen by anyone. His order was always the same: black coffee, no sugar, no milk, scrambled eggs, lightly cooked, wheat toast, no butter, and a glass of water, not iced. The same order for 30 years, same table, same routine. Even the cafeteria staff no longer noticed him. He just existed, like part of the furniture. Frank ate his meal slowly. He wasn't in a hurry, had no one to talk to. Occasionally he would look around, but his eyes never stayed in the same place for too long, as if he was constantly scanning. But what he was looking for wasn't clear. His hands had a tremor, but when he held his glass, that tremor would disappear. No one had noticed this detail. That morning, the cafeteria was crowded as usual. Young soldiers sat in groups eating their breakfast while talking about tomorrow's exercises and next week's leave. Voices were loud, laughter frequent. Frank would pretend not to hear this noise, but actually he heard every word, every laugh, every footstep. This was a habit he had learned 30 years ago. Listen to your surroundings, record everything, but never let it show. Sergeant Jake Miller, 25 years old, was a handsome and ambitious soldier. He had applied to join the Army Ranger program and was waiting for acceptance. Energetic, talkative, and generally the type who drew his friends' attention. That morning, like always, he had come to breakfast with his friends. "This weekend's exercise is going to be really tough," said Miller, taking a sip from his coffee. "They're going to keep us awake for 48 hours. His friend Peterson smiled. "Can you handle that, Miller? If you want to be accepted into Rangers, you'll have to endure much worse than this." Miller shrugged. "I'm ready. I've been waiting for an opportunity like this my whole life." As he placed his cup on the table, his hand trembled slightly and the cup turned. Coffee spilled everywhere. "Damn it," said Miller, jumping to his feet. Coffee had stained his pants. Peterson started laughing. Soldiers at other tables heard the sound too. Miller was embarrassed but tried to fix the situation. He bent down, started cleaning the spilled coffee with napkins. That's when his eyes fell on the corner table. The old man he had never paid attention to was sitting there, as always, but from Miller's angle, the man's shirt sleeve had rolled up slightly. And on his arm, Miller froze, the napkin forgotten in his hand, bent down, his eyes locked on the old man's arm. There was a tattoo there, faded but still visible. A complex design, but one Miller recognized: trident, eagle, anchor, and below it a number: Team 6. Miller's breath caught. Team 6, Navy SEAL Team 6, one of the world's most elite military units. The team that killed Osama bin Laden, legendary in life, mysterious in media, and in reality, a group whose existence was even debatable. He slowly straightened up, his eyes still on the man's arm. The old man seemed to have noticed this. He pulled his shirt sleeve down, met Miller's eyes with his own. At that moment, Miller saw no trace of age in those eyes. Calm, sharp, and infinitely deep eyes. Miller stepped back. His friends noticed his condition. "Miller, what happened? You look terrible," said Peterson. Nothing. Just." Miller looked at the old man again. The man had now finished his meal, was preparing to get up, like he always did, silently, without drawing attention. "That man," Miller whispered. "That man in the corner. Who is he?" Peterson shrugged. "I don't know. He's here every morning. Probably retired or something." "Why are you asking?" Miller couldn't answer, because if he had seen correctly, that man wasn't just any retiree. That man was a retired Navy SEAL from Team 6. And that meant Frank Thompson got up from his table. Like he always did, he took his plate and cup to the disposal area. He wasn't in any hurry, showed no anxiety, but he knew Miller was watching him. The young soldier was surprised. Frank's experienced eyes had immediately noticed this. As Frank walked toward the door, he passed by Miller. At that moment, speaking just loud enough for him to hear, "You'd better forget what you saw, son." Miller froze. Frank didn't stop, went out the door, and disappeared. Peterson saw the expression on Miller's face. "Hey, what did that man say to you?" Miller turned and looked. His friends were watching him with curiosity. What could he say? That the old man who had been sitting in the cafeteria for 30 years was actually a retiree from SEAL Team 6, the world's most secret military unit. Who would believe it? "Nothing," said Miller. "Just nothing." But that night Miller couldn't sleep. That tattoo, those eyes, and that voice kept turning in his mind. Team 6. If that man was really retired from Team 6, what had he done? Which operations had he been in? How many lives had he saved? How many enemies had he killed? The next morning, Miller went to the cafeteria early. He was there at 7:25, waiting for Frank to come. At exactly 7:30, Frank entered through the door. Like always, same clothes, same slow steps. Miller watched him. Frank sat at his table, placed his order. Miller approached. His heart was beating, but he was determined to do it. "Excuse me," said Miller, standing next to Frank's table. "I'm Sergeant Miller. Can I talk to you?" Frank looked up. There was no expression on his face. "We have nothing to talk about, son. What I saw yesterday." Miller hesitated. "That tattoo. Team 6, right?" Frank's eyes hardened. "Sit down," he said. Miller sat across from him. Frank looked at him for a long time, evaluated him. "Which unit are you in?" Frank asked. 82nd Airborne. I applied to the Ranger program." Frank smiled slightly. "Rangers. Good boys, but far from the work we did." "Were you really from Team 6? Frank took a sip from his coffee. "I got that tattoo in 1987, after the Grenada operation." Miller's eyes widened. "Grenada? So you were?" 25 years active duty," Frank said in a calm voice. "All over the world, in places you can't see, with names you can't hear." Why are you here? I mean, here in this cafeteria." Frank's smile deepened. "Because here no one looks at me twice. Here I'm just an old man, and sometimes that feels pretty good." Miller was trying to understand. "But you're a legend. People should know you, respect you." Frank shook his head. "No, son, the best operations are the ones no one knows about. The best soldiers are the ones no one recognizes. I did my job, retired. Now I live quietly." "Well, let me tell you something," said Frank, leaning forward. "If you get accepted to Rangers, remember, the greatest successes are the ones no one knows about. The quieter you are, the more effective you are." At that moment, there was a commotion in the cafeteria. Someone was shouting. Frank and Miller turned their heads. An argument had broken out at a table. 2 soldiers were shouting at each other. Others were trying to separate them. Suddenly, it became clear that the situation was getting out of control. One of the soldiers punched the other. A fight started. Everyone around stood up. Some moved away, some tried to intervene. Frank quietly stood up. Miller watched him. The old man walked toward the fight, but didn't run. Calm, measured steps. One of the fighters, a large soldier, had knocked the other to the ground and was on top of him. Those around were trying to pull him off, but he wasn't listening. Even the sergeant trying to control the situation couldn't succeed. Frank reached the fighter. What surprised Miller was what Frank did. Nothing. He just stood there, next to the fighter, silently. The large soldier noticed Frank. "What do you want, old man? Get out of here." Frank said nothing. He just looked at him. That calm, deep, and infinitely powerful look. The soldier hesitated for a moment. What he saw in Frank's eyes disturbed him. He had seen these eyes before, but where? "I said get out!" the soldier shouted again, but this time there was some uncertainty in his voice. Frank slowly leaned forward, approached the soldier's ear, and said something very quietly. Miller couldn't hear what he said, but he saw the effect. The soldier immediately backed away. His face had turned white. He looked at Frank, then around, then at Frank again. Without saying anything, he stood up and left the cafeteria. The fight was over. Everyone was looking at Frank in amazement, but Frank said nothing again. He returned to his table, finished his coffee, and left, as always. Miller caught up with him. "What did you say to him?" Frank stopped, looked at Miller. "I told him my real name, your name, my real name. He recognized me." Miller didn't understand. "How so?" "That soldier served in Afghanistan in 2011. We were there too. We saved him in an operation. He's been remembering my face since then." Miller was surprised. Were you in that operation?" Frank said nothing. He just continued walking. From that day on, Miller's view of Frank changed. Every morning he saw him in the cafeteria, but no longer saw him as just an old man. He saw him as living history, a walking legend, a silent hero. But Frank didn't change anything. He still sat at the same table, ordered the same meals, maintained the same silence. Because real heroes are like that. They're not known by what they do, but by what they don't do. Not by their words, but by their silence. A week later, Miller's Ranger's application was accepted. On his last day in the cafeteria, he went to Frank's table. "I was accepted," said Miller. Frank smiled. "I knew it. You'll succeed at this." "I want to ask you something," said Miller. "How many operations were you in?" Frank hesitated. "More than I can count." "What was the hardest operation?" Frank thought for a long time. "The hardest operation," he said finally, "is the one that never happened. Because if we did our job right, it should never have happened." Miller understood. "Not to fight, but to prevent war. Now you understand." Miller stood up. "Thank you. I learned a lot from you." Frank nodded. "Go, son. And remember, the greatest victories are the ones no one knows about." Miller left the cafeteria. He was going to Rangers training, to a new life, but he would never forget. The old man sitting in the cafeteria wasn't just an old man. He was the hero of epics written in the pages of history, but actually lived. Frank remained alone at his table. He finished his coffee, cleared his plate, and left. Tomorrow he would come again. Same time, same table, same order. Because real heroes live like this, quietly, humbly, and never bragging. But now something had changed in the cafeteria. Miller's friends had started looking at Frank differently. They looked at him more respectfully, made room for him, and greeted him silently. Frank noticed this but said nothing. Because sometimes the most powerful words are the ones not spoken. Sometimes the greatest stories are the ones lived and forgotten. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the people no one recognizes, but everyone needs. Frank Thompson, sitting in the cafeteria, carried the weight of his past. But this weight didn't give him pain, it gave him strength. Because he knew that every operation he had done, every life he had saved, every war he had prevented, was so that the young people now sitting in this cafeteria could live in a safer world. And this was more valuable than any medal, any title, any recognition. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like this? Someone who seemed ordinary but had an extraordinary past, living quietly but having done great things? Share their story in the comments, because here at The Human Stories, we speak for those who don't speak. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, because people like Frank Thompson are waiting to be seen. Their silence deserves to be heard. See you in the next story, and remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are the quietest ones.